esta nueva sesión de la tarde con la intervención, con la participación de María Manuela Pereira y Rui Miguel Pereira. Se va a referir a la familia Vargas-Lobo, alrededor de 7 generaciones, entre 1471 y 1661. María Manuela es licenciada en Química por la Universidad de Lisboa. Impartió además materias de Física y Química en bachillerato. Por su parte, Rui Pereira es licenciado en Ingeniería Física Tecnológica del Instituto Superior Técnico de Lisboa y obtuvo un doctorado en Física en la misma institución. Es experto en física de partículas, ha hecho una carrera en ese tema, luego pasó al sector privado y ahora desarrolla softwares en banca de inversión. Es director de la APG desde 2022 y su secretario en funciones de 2023. De tal manera que resulta interesante oír a un experto en física de partículas hablando sobre genealogía. Yo creo que debe tener una precisión física impresionante al momento de hacer este trabajo genealógico. Así que, por favor, adelante, María y Rui.
Hola, buenas tardes. Me gusta muchísimo de estar aquí con vosotros. No hablo muy bien el español, pero creo que me entienden un poquito. No voy a hablar mucho. Yo he estudiado mi familia y la familia de mi esposo y las familias que son relacionadas, y ahora tengo muchísima información de muchísimas familias que no sabía que yo pertenecía. Ahora he hecho esta investigación con mi hijo, que es un experto. Yo no sé si puedo decir, él es tan bueno en genealogía como él es en física de partículas. Él podría haber un doctorado en genealogía porque es realmente un gran investigador de genealogía. Excúsenme por hablar tan malo esta lengua.
Muy bien.
Porque no he jamás ido a clases para aprender, solamente por oír, pero yo tengo ancestros en España, soy muy contenta por eso. Gracias.
Hola, muy buenas tardes. Pues que van a disculparme por no hacer esta presentación en español, pero creo que no sería posible para mí. Sería un poquito más difícil, entonces voy a hacerla en inglés. Thank you for having me here. Thank you to the organizers, to everyone. So this presentation is about a family that lived in Tangier, the Vargas-Lobo family, and the 7 generations of alfaqueques, and we will see exactly what that is for those of you who don't know. We are both members of the Portuguese Association of Genealogy. I will start by introducing the geographical context of this. So Tangier, as probably all of us know, is a city which is in present-day Morocco. It's just across the Gibraltar Strait. It was a Portuguese territory from 1471 to 1661, and then in 1661 it was ceded to England as part of the dowry of Catherine of Braganza's marriage to Charles II. So this is the period just after the period that was discussed of the Spanish-Brazilian period so in 1661, we are at the point where both Portugal and in England are in a rather fragile situation. The Duke of Braganza is still not recognized by Spain as the King of Portugal. That won't happen until 1668. And in England, we have, I think we are just leaving the Commonwealth period, so Charles II is also still in a rather fragile position. So Tangier becomes an English territory, and it will be an English territory until 1684. Eventually, the English, let's say the English bet in Tangier was not very successful, but obviously England never gave up on their idea of having a strategic point at the entrance of the Mediterranean, and not many years later, the English seized Gibraltar, and they are still there, as we all know. To begin the genealogical part of this presentation, we will start with Jerónimo Vargas-Lobo, who was born in Tangier in 1633. So he had to move out of Tangier in 1661, like most of the Portuguese population, and he moved to the Algarve, so the southern part of Portugal, mainland Portugal, like most of the inhabitants of Tangier. Jerónimo was from a rather important family in Tangier, and he eventually became the captain major, or the military governor of the town of Lolé in the Algarve, and he died there in 1678. That's his death record. He married twice. His first marriage was still in Tangier in 1652 to Júlia Castelino, who was a great-granddaughter of a man named Paulo Castellino, a man from Genoa, who is the ancestor of all the people of this surname in Portugal. There are still some people of this surname in Portugal who are descended from Paulo Castellino, although those are descended not from this branch, but from another one. And the second marriage of Jerónimo was already after he left Tangier to a woman named Maria da Fonseca, who carried the prefix of Dona. The descendants of Jerónimo include the Gama-Lobo family of Lolé, which has this nice house in Lolé with this coat of arms of the Lobo family. Lobo, of course, means wolf, and the coat of arms shows wolves. And the descendants also include the Camelo Lampreia family of Brazil, through a son called João Lobo de Sampaio. So this eventually, the descendants of João Lobo de Sampaio eventually married into a Lampreia family, and then the Lampreia descendants, one of them married into the Camelo family, and the Camelo Lampreia, there was a member of the family that became the Portuguese ambassador to Brazil in the late 19th century, and eventually they had a long line of diplomats, which actually included, in an interesting twist of history, after we have a Brazilian ambassador to Portugal who was descended from the Portuguese ambassador to Brazil, and that Brazilian ambassador to Portugal was also the Brazilian Minister for Foreign Affairs in the late 20th century. Apart from those Camelo Lampreia, the descendants of João Lobo de Sampaio also include, through a branch that is Lampreia but not Camelo, my mother and I. And the Gama-Lobo family is descended from a son of the second marriage, which is Diogo Lobo Pereira. João Lobo de Sampaio is from the first marriage. Returning to Jerónimo Vargas-Lobo, he had an important role during the evacuation of Tangier in 1661. So in 1663, the people from Tangier, who were called the Tangerines, as you might expect, they are designated as such in the Portuguese documentation, the Tangerinos. And in the city of Tavira in 1663, many of them sign a proxy to a man named Martim Soeiro, and Jerónimo signs not only by himself, but also in the name of his sisters, Ana and Joana, his aunt Isabel, and all the widows that could not write. So we can see here that he was a sort of a community leader, and in that document there is an interesting reference. He's mentioned as the alfaqueque. And what is an alfaqueque? This is a word that was used in both Portuguese and Spanish, and this was a person who was responsible for negotiating the redemption of captives with the Moors. So when there were war prisoners, there was a person that was charged with this, and the specific designation for this role, especially in the exchanges between the Christians and the Muslims, was this word alfaqueque. As we know, this is a role that is still important even today, unfortunately, in situations of war or conflict. And we can determine easily who were the parents of Jerónimo Vargas-Lobo. This is known from the marriage, his first marriage in 1652. His parents were João Lobo and Isabel Álvares. And in that image that is shown in this slide, this is the image from a book that was published in 1922 in Portugal, which is the full transcript of all the records from the Tangier Cathedral since 1582 up to the Portuguese leaving in 1661 and even a few years after that. So you have the record there. And so the parents of Jerónimo Vargas-Lobo were João Lobo and Isabel Álvares. Of course, the question is, can we go back further in the Lobo surname? Where did the Gama surname come from? Well, we can go back to the previous generation, and we can see that the parents of Jerónimo married in Tangier also in 1618, and they appear with longer names here, João Lobo de Sampaio and Isabel Álvares Pereira. And we know from this record that the parents of João were Diogo Fernandes de Sampaio and Tomásia Lobo, and they lived in Lisbon at the time. Isabel's parents were Jerónimo Borges and Ana Rodrigues Pereira, and they lived in Tangier. And here you see something that is completely unsurprising to anyone who has done Portuguese genealogy, which is the surnames not only come from the father, sometimes they come from the mother, sometimes they come from the grandfather, and who knows, the Portuguese were very creative with that. Until quite recently, until 1900, you had this sort of sometimes a bit chaotic naming system. So from this record, you know these names, and we can actually go to a published work from the early 18th century, which is a work which was basically about the whole geography and history of Portugal, reference work called Corografia do Reino de Portugal, who was published between 1706 and 1712, and it actually mentions Diogo and Tomásia as ancestors of a family, the Rangel de Macedo family, and there Tomásia appears with the surnames Lobo da Gama. She appears as Tomásia Lobo da Gama. So from this, you can see that the Gama surname is coming from Tomásia. And they have these descendants who are the Rangel de Macedo, who, by an interesting twist, they had a great-grandson called Diogo Rangel de Macedo, who was a rather famous Portuguese genealogist. A bit more on that later. Now, returning to the job of alfaqueque, actually, if we go to this book that was published, which is a transcript of a summary of old notarial records from Lisbon, we can see that there is a document from 1634 where Jerónimo's father, João Lobo de Sampaio, is documented as alfaqueque of Tangier. And this document is a proxy that was made to him for him to negotiate the release of a captive. And so we see that at least Jerónimo was the second alfaqueque in his family. And the question is it possible to find any document that related to the nomination of João for this position? And the answer is yes. He was appointed in 1622. So this is a document from the Royal Chancellery at the time when Portugal was under Spanish rule. So this is from Philip III of Portugal, Philip IV of Spain. And in that document, we come to know that João's father, Diogo Fernandes de Sampaio, had already been an alfaqueque himself. So we can see that there are 3 generations of alfaqueques, but actually also in that document we come to know that Diogo Fernandes de Sampaio had inherited this position from his father-in-law, who was named João Varela, in 1602. And he had earned the right to this position through the marriage to his daughter, Tomásia Lobo. So from this document, we know the name of Tomásia's father, and that name was João Varela. Now, there is a number of documents about João Varela. These, like the documents that I showed previously regarding the Chancellery of Philip III, is in the National Archive in Lisbon, the Torre do Tombo. And we know from this document, which is a letter of recommendation, written by his milk brother, Bernardino de Carvalho, who was a governor of Tangier and also a governor of a smaller town that was also a Portuguese possession, Alcácer Seguer, which is more or less halfway between Ceuta and Tangier. And in 1556, Bernardino de Carvalho wrote this letter of recommendation to the Queen Regent, Catherine of Austria. So Catherine was the widow of King John III. She was the grandmother of King Sebastian, who was still a young child at the time. And from this document, we know that João Varela also had origins in Alcácer Seguer. I am not entirely sure if he was born there. He was probably born there. He was the oldest son of Diogo Varela, who had died in combat against the Moors. And in this document from 1556, he is described as a brave knight with 18 years of service who had already served in Alcácer Seguer and also in Mazagan, another military stronghold of the Portuguese in what is now Morocco. And he had also served as ship captain. Now, João Varela was appointed alfaqueque of Tangier in 1559. So what appears is that he was already probably not as young as his wife. He was probably something like, 40-something years old. And probably through these good connections that he had, he got this marriage to Tomasia and he got this position as alfaqueque. Of course, the question is João Varela the earliest alfaqueque? And the answer is no, because this document from 1559 already mentions that he gets this position from his father-in-law, who was named Tomé Lobo, because he was marrying Tomé's daughter. Of course, the question is, what was the name of Tomé's daughter? And the answer is, we don't know. So we will call her Mrs. Varela. So this is from the Chancellery of King Sebastian. And we have this interesting situation where we know the name of Tomé Lobo, we know the descendants that kept the surname Lobo, but we don't know one of the links, we don't know her name. We only know she was the wife of João Varela. And this is the furthest that we can go in the Lobo family. So Tomé Lobo was probably born around 1500. His surname was passed through his daughter to his granddaughter Tomasia, and here I should mention that Tomé is a Portuguese variant of the name Tomás, which also exists in Portuguese. So basically Tomasia is female for Tomé, and that is probably not accidental. And the names of this family and a few other hints and a few other family connections strongly suggest that this family originates in Olivença, where there was a well-known Lobo da Gama family, or should I say more than one, because there are branches that cannot be connected to each other. But unfortunately, so far, this is, let's say, yet another branch that cannot be connected to the other ones. So this is what we know about the Lobo family, but we can go a bit further in other parts of the family. And we can actually determine that there were earlier generations already with this office of alfaqueque. So Tomé Lobo actually got the position, like his successors, from his father-in-law. And his father-in-law was named Sebastião de Vargas. Sebastião de Vargas was... and this is documented in a letter that was written by Sebastião himself to King John III in 1539, when Sebastião was the Portuguese representative at the court of the King of Fez, in present-day Morocco, of course, and the property of the position of alfaqueque was disputed by a rival candidate. So what this means was that, Sebastião is a very interesting person. He was born around 1480 in Africa, most likely in Tangier, but we know he was born in Africa because he wrote himself, I was born in Africa. He served a number of positions in Tangier and in Lisbon also. And he served in India as the secretary of the governor Dom Duarte de Menezes between 1521 and 1524. And Menezes had been previously the governor of Tangier for 13 years from 1508. The governorship of Dom Duarte de Menezes in India was not successful. To the extent that when he I can tell you that the king was very unhappy with the situation, and he sent as his replacement none other than Vasco da Gama himself, the discoverer, who was already quite old. And actually, he arrived there, replaced Menezes, and died in India a few months later. So Menezes returns to mainland Portugal. He is exiled or imprisoned, and also his entourage is also obviously has the same fate. And Sebastião de Vargas appears to have been exiled for about 10 years, but later he must have been, at least to a certain extent, rehabilitated, and he becomes the agent of Portugal in the court of Fez between 1539 and 1543, in a period of peace, a truce between, Fez and Portugal. And then the last documents that we have related to Sebastião de Vargas are a few letters that he wrote from Azila in 1545. Azila is another city in present-day Morocco, not far from Tangier, which was also a Portuguese possession at the time. There are 67, none less than 67 surviving letters written by Vargas in 6 years between 1539 and 45, and most of them were written to the King John III. So his official mandate in Fez was to negotiate the purchase of wheat, but the actual scope, as you might imagine, was a bit broader than that. And so with such a trove of documents, several authors mentioned him in their works. Most notably, Robert Ricard in 1948 wrote this Sebastião de Vargas, agent de Jean III de Portugal au Maroc, et le projet d'alliance entre le Portugal et le Royaume de Fez, which was published among other publications as part of these magnificent collections of documents pertaining to the ancient history of what is now Morocco. And there is also a full book on Sebastião de Vargas that was published by António Horta Correia in 2016, a book that is, we have the cover there, and that António Horta Correia, I can say that we have the pleasure of meeting, we know him personally, and he's actually our very, very distant relative, also through one other line that is not related to the one that we are discussing here. So, continuing to the Vargas and the Lobo family. So, again, there is no name for the daughter of Sebastião through which Tomé Lobo gets his job, but in this case there is a document, we have already found a document that shows her name. Her name was Catarina de Vargas, and we know her name from the testimony she provided in 1556 for the Inquisition trial of a former governor of Tangier called João Álvares de Azevedo, who was basically accused of using his governorship for his own profit. It's a very, very interesting document. It has documents in Spanish, it has documents in Portuguese, it has documents in Arabic. It's a fascinating document. It mentions all sorts of things. It describes in detail the evacuation of Azila, the families that came from Azila to Tangier because the Portuguese had to evacuate Azila in 1550, 1551. So it's very interesting. And we can also know the name of the wife of Sebastião de Vargas, and her name was Maria Rodrigues de Aguiar. Because we know this name, for instance, from a document from 1548, when she was already widowed from Sebastião and she was granted a pension. Her name and some of her family connections strongly suggest a connection to Madeira Island and possibly a descent from the Madeira discoverer João Gonçalves Zarco, but this is something that is also not proven, so we cannot say anything further than that. we can still go to a 7th generation of alfaqueques because Sebastião de Vargas, in one of his countless letters, also mentions that his father had been alfaqueque, and we can find his name in this document from 1505, and his name was Tristão Fernandes. And there is actually a couple of documents with the signature of Tristão Fernandes, which is that trembling signature on the left in this document, and this document is from 1514, and we know that Tristão was born around 1438, so by this time he was already in his 70s. And we know that he died around 1523, when his son was serving in India as secretary of Governor Menezes. So, and Tristão...
We are going to finish.
I'm just coming to the end. So Tristão was actually appointed alfaqueque of Tangier as part of the conquest. So he was. The Portuguese army left Lisbon in August the 15th. They conquered the Zila in the 24th. Entered Tangier, who was left by the Moors in the 4th of September, and Tristão became alfaqueque on the spot. Personally by King Afonso V on the 7th of September. This is illustrated in one of the Pastrana tapestries. And so, to summarize, we have 7 generations of alfaqueques from 1471 to 1661, 7 generations of the same family, the ones that I already mentioned. We know no further than this, for sure, but the genealogist Cristóvão Alão de Moraes, writing in 1667, mentioned that Tristão Fernandes de Vargas was alfaqueque of Tangier and chief of this surname in Portugal, for which reason these arms were registered by order of King Dom Manuel in the year 1512, and they are, and then there is the description of this coat of arms, and they say they are from Jerez. Of course, the original document from 1512 appears to be lost. It does make sense. This date, 1512, corresponds more or less to the time when Sebastião went from Tangier to Lisbon to serve some offices in the court. So it makes sense that Sebastião had to ascertain his lineage. It totally makes sense that he had asked for some kind of recognition. And since his father was already living, this strongly suggests a very close Castilian ancestry, which is still not entirely proven. We do know that Sebastião, in one of his letters, mentions that he is a legitimate male line descendant of Garci Pérez de Vargas Machuca, a hero of the conquest of Seville in the mid-13th century. But of course, this is not entirely proven. We don't know if all the details were correct. Just as a final note, there is a number of branches of this family that cannot be proven to be descended from Tristão and Sebastião. So this line that we showed can be proven due to the transmission of the office of alfaqueque. There are many other people of the names Lobo and Vargas in Tangier. One of them is the ancestry of the poet Fernando Pessoa. Unfortunately, that line is still not established. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Muy bien, muchas gracias María. Rui, quien además tiene el cargo de ser el director de la Asociación Portuguesa de Genealogía, institución hermana, y muchísimas gracias.